We're so excited to share what we've been up to the past, I don't know, 9 months or so. So Nathan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, good afternoon now, everybody. My name is Nathan Garibay. I'm the emergency manager here in Deschutes County, and in our county, the emergency management function is under the Sheriff's office. So I've been in public safety about 25 years. Had a few years in the fire service and EMS, and I kind of fell into a cop job about 21 years ago, and kind of done a lot in law enforcement. But in the last 7 years, I had an opportunity to come back into something that kind of addressed a little bit more of my first love, which was fire stuff. And so this was a great opportunity 7 years ago. So here I am. I'm coming up on my 7th anniversary of being the emergency manager, and definitely have learned a lot and continue to learn a lot. And over the rest of my career, I probably will know just a fraction of what we all want to know. But it's been an exciting ride, and a number of folks that I see on the call today are good teammates and partners of mine, and I appreciate all the help and support they've provided. So thank you for having us.
And I'm Hayley. I work for Deschutes County Sheriff's Office with Nathan. I'm an emergency services coordinator focusing on disaster recovery. And I also have a fire background. You can see me lighting off a meadow there in Yosemite. Then more recently, I became a disaster case manager in 2014 to help people who were impacted by the Carlton and Okanagan complex fires in north central Washington to fully recover from that incident. I also helped found the Metro Housing Trust and sat on the Okanagan County Long-Term Recovery Group board as a board member. And some of you might know Carleen Anders. She is the executive director for that organization. My term just ended in December of 2019. And now I'm here with the Sheriff's Office, helping to build a plan for recovery and develop the relationships that we need to do that as well as we can. Whoops. Nathan.
All right. So one of the things we found ourselves in was the circumstance of that really there was no cohesive plan for how our area would recover from a large disaster. Obviously, because of where we live, and wildland fire is a preeminent concern here. However, we wanted to make sure that we considered an all hazards or all risk approach, and make sure that we were not just focusing on wildland fire. This has been something that Ed Keith and Allison Green and Katie Lighthall and I had numerous discussions over the last several years of how we could kind of get a recovery plan or framework off the ground. And it wasn't until last year that we stumbled onto Hayley, who moved to our area with the background with the Carlton and Okanagan complex fires and the work that she was involved in up there. That we really saw an opportunity to capitalize on that and bring Hayley on board and help us move forward with this. I think the challenge is that because we don't have this plan, that we leave ourselves at risk of having a really uncoordinated and ineffective recovery process. And that ultimately affects our community in that it's going to increase human suffering. It puts us in a situation where unjust or improper policies and practices are developed, and ultimately increases the cost of recovery, both on an economic as well as a human component. So with that, we wanted to move forward. So we brought Hayley on late last summer, and really what we learned was there's very few communities out in the United States that have really well-developed recovery. I would say that is probably a function of the fact that in emergency management, which usually is the holder of most plans or at least participant, we're heavily engaged in a lot of planning efforts, but really it surrounds more short-term tactical strategic objectives, how we can minimize immediate loss of life and property. And you know, sometimes we fail to recognize that an ineffective recovery could potentially actually far surpass damages, whether it's human or economic, than what the initial disaster could. So I think we sometimes fail to recognize that, and we kind of get ourselves into an alligator closest to the boat situation, right? So, you know, we keep smacking that alligator with the oar to keep it away. You know, that's the evacuation plan or the CWPP or these things that we have to do. But yet that disaster is looming large somewhere, and it might be that big giant alligator that's under the boat that's about to flip us over, and we don't even see it coming. So we really identified a need to put some effort and energy into this and recognize that it's going to be a long process. And you know, we do recognize that that there's a significant investment in preparedness, whether it's preparing planning wise or otherwise, that can help mitigate and save a lot of money down the road. And so we as a nation, sometimes it feels like we don't. And if you look at COVID right now, there's all sorts of coulda, woulda, shouldas that we probably should have started doing 10 years ago and we didn't. So it's a perfect example of, you know, we could have saved ourselves a lot of heartache with, you know, a relatively less investment in preparedness.
So going back to that challenge that Nathan identified, which was that very few communities invest in planning for recovery, means that there just aren't a whole lot of processes to replicate. So we had to do some wayfinding. And really what that meant for us was envisioning where we're headed and knowing where we are now because of where we've been. So what we did was create this, basically a project proposal, or a project description that communicates the parameters of the project to our prospective partners and our partners that we have now, so they could learn more about the project. And then it also identifies the need for a plan and proposes ideas for what to do and how we might do it. And then I'll put some links in the chat for you guys a little later so that you can access this document. So here is what we thought the process might look like at the outset. It's very linear. We thought we'd bring together a collaborative planning team to basically build a guest list for a broad community engagement process, and then break into work groups. And from there, test the framework, decide where we needed to adjust it, adjust the framework, and then evaluate and approve it, and then update it over time. Honestly, what this actually looks like is more of a crazy slinky spiral because of real world things like COVID, and then just people moving in and out of positions. And yeah, so I would say it still sort of looks like this, but I would encourage folks to not think too linearly when you're developing a plan. So one of the other challenges was that the partners in recovery weren't identified, and it can be kind of difficult to engage people in preparedness planning, as some of you might be experiencing. Luckily, when I came on the scene, Nathan and Ashley had developed all these amazing relationships, so that was huge. And it's really, those relationships are really central to the planning process, especially with disaster recovery because it's so massive. So we had a really good start at building the team. And how we did this was we just started, I think what the first couple weeks that I was with Nathan and Ashley at DCSO was we looked at the impacts. I think we looked at maybe wildfire. What are the impacts? Who are the organizations and the people that might be able to meet the needs of those impacts? So it started out like this. Then we put it into Coggle just to make it a little bit more neat. So that was the start of the process. We know in disaster recovery that all of these different systems can be impacted by an event, right? And I love that FactNet also is using a web. I saw that, so I think we're all on the right track here with what we're doing. But basically, all of these systems can be impacted by an event. And we know that if one piece of this web is moved, it's going to affect other pieces of the web, right? And it's going to affect the entire community. So zooming out a little bit, these are what the state of Oregon refers to as recovery support functions. No, state recovery functions. The feds call these recovery support functions. So I'm going to zoom out a bit more on these. These are very important. They're the systems that uphold our communities. But what we also know is that there are many other programs and tasks and elements that need to get done in times of disaster to make sure that we have a holistic recovery. So communications, super important. We need transparency, disaster case management, unmet needs, donations and volunteer management, a recovery organization structure, and of course, funding for recovery.
Yeah, and so part of that is obviously with all those recovery functions and all those processes that need to be developed, there's a large tranche of expertise out in our community and in our region, and so we need to engage that. I think from an emergency management perspective, we always joke that, you know, we are jacks of all trade and master of none. And I know a little bit about most disasters to be dangerous. So my job is really to facilitate, and our job, is to facilitate getting the right people to the table to help make good decisions and good informed decisions. And by the way, Hayley mentioned Ashley. Ashley Volz is another one of our teammates here in emergency management. We're really blessed here to have a great team, and she works with us. She's just not involved significantly in the recovery because there's plenty of work to do. So, so you know, we want to make sure we include those experts. But then, just as important is we need to include those that are most impacted by the decisions. And you know, I think oftentimes it seems like we have a lot of influencers in our community, and oftentimes those tend to be high influence, high means, maybe disproportionately less affected by the disaster. Not necessarily, but sometimes, but certainly have more resources at their disposal. Whereas a number of the folks that are most impacted by catastrophic events tend to be folks that have less influence and less resources, less means. And so it's important to incorporate those perspectives, and in some cases, take advantage of those folks in our community that really are influential and get them to think, and not that they don't already, but to incorporate them into our process to help, you know, take care of everyone in the community, and so that we can serve the greatest need. And I think it's also important to note that sometimes it's a challenge to incorporate voices that typically aren't involved in our lovely bureaucratic government processes, because it's really a foreign environment to them. And I think Hayley has a great example of that, but that it really turned out to be a valuable relationship.
Yeah, so we, and this isn't a recovery example necessarily, although we are trying to include a broader range of folks in this COVID recovery. But one example of including decision makers and people who are impacted was in my last role as a direct service program manager. We brought in a client into the hiring process, and that client informed who we hired next. And it was incredible. She blew us away, and we ended up using all of her recommendations and hired the right person for our clients. So here's kind of a nitty-gritty view of what it looked like for us to build the team. We talked about those recovery functions. We tried to build a team that had good geographic representation. And then of course, we looked at what we perceived as people's strengths and skills that they would bring to the table. And this was a little bit of a guess, but I think we did a pretty good job. So recovery by its very nature does not lend itself well to a traditional written plan. And I'm gonna zoom us through this really quickly because I think we've got about 5 minutes. We wanna make sure and leave a lot of time for questions. But in my experience, this Knabben framework by David Snowden is what, for me, after having been through a recovery, it was a wonderful sense-making tool. And I think it's worth looking at a little bit closer. So basically, you'll see that this screen is kind of cut in half with unordered environments on one side and ordered environments on the other side. And the short of this is that recovery really lives in this complex domain where we see parenting and where cause and effect aren't necessarily repeatable, and they're pretty confusing. Response, in my opinion, lives in this kind of chaotic realm where we're really kind of pinning the tail on the donkey. We are acting, sensing, and responding. And here is where ICS, the Incident Command System, works really, really well, because we need stability, and we need one leader to make quick decisions. Even if they might not be the wrong ones, we can fix them the next day. Whereas recovery, we've got a lot of leaders. We need a lot of people to get the hard work of recovery done. And in this domain or environment, what we're doing is kind of probing the system, seeing what comes back to us, making some adjustments, and responding. Another example of this might be homelessness. That's an example of a wicked problem that needs to be solved, and it's complicated. Complex, I should say.
So, Bob Stilger reminded us that, ultimately we're striving to create a plan that lives in the hearts and the minds of people and ultimately belongs to our community. And on the next slide, there's a picture, and this is actually our kickoff meeting that we held in January. And if you look up at the front of the audience, Hayley and I are up there presenting / facilitating, mostly trying to facilitate, although sometimes I do more presenting. But it'd be easy to think, well, it's our plan, but ultimately that plan belongs to every single person in that room and many, many more. And so we want to really develop something that doesn't belong to Hayley and I, that will live on when, we're retired or move on to greener pastures or, dirt pastures or whatever. And, that it doesn't necessarily rely on Hayley and I to be effective. And so ultimately, it's really important to incorporate the community in developing the plan that they want to see for their community. And I think, oh no, sorry, that's Hayley's slide. I apologize.
Did you have more on this one, Nathan?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Sorry, I got myself tied up.
So we spent almost this entire meeting, this kickoff meeting, asking questions and asking the group to come up with the questions that they wanted answered through this process. We did not spend any time finding solutions, which I think is important. And I think it was pretty successful. Here is an example of one exercise that we did. We asked participants to list their strengths and then also the strengths and resources that their affiliation might bring to the recovery table. And this exercise, I'd say for Nathan and I, was a little bit uncomfortable thinking about how to do this, but it was so successful. People were really into it. The level of energy in the room and the volume was high. So we will continue to push ourselves to be a little bit uncomfortable and take some risks as we gather people. And I can't stress that enough. It's been good. Here are just a few of the questions that they came up with. This is a very small sampling. What are our strengths as a community? How will we balance speed and deliberation of recovery? What can we do to get citizens better prepared?
And this was the slide I was trying to jump to back there. Sorry. This just is kind of a picture we took at the end of our meeting, and a few folks had to leave before the picture's taken, but it's just a really representative sample of the folks we involved in, and incorporates government agencies, social service organizations, just members of the community. To Katie Lighthall's point on the chat, we involved youth, recognizing that we're building the plan or the framework that they will implement. And it's amazing sometimes the perception and the smarts that come out of our young people. And so we even incorporated them, and it was a great opportunity. And I think ultimately incorporating all these different perspectives and viewpoints really helps us set a community vision, some expectations and values for future decisions that we'll make in the disaster recovery decision space that will be really hard. And if we've already thought through some of these and incorporated and kind of established community values and expectations, it will help inform us so that we can at least make them at least informed, right? I mean, we may not make everybody happy. We're probably not going to make everybody happy, but as a community, we have those common set of values and expectations. And so it was a great experience. And to Hayley's point, there are a few of us are kind of surly, public safety type folks. It was, some of these exercises were a little hard to do, but at the end, they ended up being very successful.
So here's another challenge, just lack of understanding and experience. And this goes both ways, right? So we talked about engaging experts within those systems, those state recovery functions. And then also it is kind of hard to find people who have lived through a recovery. And I will say that working with someone or someone's experience that has been through a recovery as a community member that has suffered from disaster is very different than working with someone who comes into communities to solve problems for communities. One thing that Bob Stilger, one of my mentors has said is that whatever the problem, whatever the challenge, community is the answer. And I have experienced that in recovery and agree. So the solution to that for us is just learning together. We continue to learn, and I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, to the FACT Learning Network, which is and always putting out incredible learning resources. But basically, this is what it looked like for us, has looked like for us during times of COVID, taking this learning online and doing our small group work online. So this is our org structure group and our natural and cultural resources group. Of course, just providing resources is another part of learning. And I did a ton of research at the get-go and consolidated all this stuff. You guys are welcome to it. If you want it, I can send a link. And then find mentors and coaches. I love all the pictures of Doc Rivers because he is always listening. He starts with listening. And I think that's a really important lesson for us too, in both pre-disaster recovery planning and post-disaster recovery planning, that we start by listening and then move forward from there.
And so the next challenge, or I think this is our last challenge we're talking about, is it takes a long time to do it well. And so I think we need to resist the urge to try to do it quickly and get a plan on paper. I think that's always our urge, is like, the boss says, hey, you need a recovery plan. And the initial reaction is, okay, I'll get you a plan. It may not be worth the paper it's written on, but I will get you a plan. And so I think doing it right is worth the time and the effort and the resources that we've committed. And just remember that it can look different. So work on little pieces here and there. It can start with just some research, building on the relationships that, or developing new relationships, or education. And that will inspire further growth and development and getting people on the bus to get us down the road where we want to be. So thank you very much.